The man at table 7 didn't look like he owned the place. A whisper from the kitchen door would soon freeze him solid. His dark sweater was frayed at the cuffs. His cap pulled low enough to shadow the edge of his eyes, and he stirred his black coffee with the slow, unhurried patience of someone with nowhere to rush. The gold chandeliers above glinted off the crystal mugs on neighboring tables, but none of that light touched him like he was just passing through. But this was no casual visitor. This was James Luther King, owner of Paschal's restaurant, the Atlanta institution his father built, the space that once hummed with laughter and the scent of smothered greens and honor. And not a single person in the room knew it. For 3 weeks, the whispers had piled up. Anonymous notes slipped with dessert plates, handwritten notes from longtime patrons, concerned phone calls from suppliers, calls from regulars who'd eaten there since John Luther King Jr. First hung the sign, even a text from a former line cook, short and sharp. The soul's gone out of it. John had started Paschal's, with a rule he'd drilled into James since he was a boy polishing silverware after school. A business doesn't fail when profits drop. It fails when hearts grow cold. James had grown up watching his father stop mid-service to bandage a busboy's scraped knee, to sit with a lonely regular and buy them pie, to tell the line cooks their grits were the best in Georgia, even on the days they burned the bacon. Now, as he sat there, he could feel that coldness seep through the carpet. His father had built this place on a single principle: dignity for all who walked through its doors. John Luther King Jr. used to say, "Son, you can tell the soul of a business by how it treats the ones who serve." Now James feared that soul had been buried beneath polished silverware and fake smiles. So he went undercover. But to understand why James was willing to walk into his own restaurant as a stranger, you'd have to go back 25 years to a small kitchen in West Atlanta, where a young boy watched his father knead dough at 4 a.m., whispering a prayer over every loaf.
Before we begin, click subscribe to support our growth and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and you won't want to miss them.
Let's get back to the story. James parked his Mercedes 3 blocks away, slipped his Rolex into the glove compartment, and walked into Paschal's like a weary traveler seeking breakfast. No one greeted him at the door. The hostess barely glanced up, her smile tight and mechanical. The dining room was stunning. Crystal glasses catching morning light, white tablecloths crisp as fresh snow, the faint scent of butter and cinnamon in the air. But beneath the elegance, something felt hollow. The waitstaff moved like shadows, silent and tense. No laughter, no warmth, just the clinking of plates and the hum of obligation. James chose a corner table near the kitchen, settling into the leather booth with quiet purpose. A young waitress approached, her movements careful, measured. Her name tag read Amy Jane London. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her smile, though exhausted, was genuine. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded warmly. "Good morning. Coffee, please. And a side of toast." Simple order. Simple test. As Amy Jane poured his coffee, James watched. He watched how she glanced nervously toward the kitchen door. How the cook, Brian Flax, a man who'd worked beside his father 20 years ago, moved with hunched shoulders and trembling hands. How conversation died the moment a certain figure entered the room. Peter Crouch. The supervisor was broad-shouldered and slick-haired, dressed in a tailored vest that screamed authority he hadn't earned. He moved through the dining room with false charm, greeting wealthy guests with a politician's smile. But when their backs turned, his face hardened into something cold. "Amy Jane." Peter's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Table 12 has been waiting 5 minutes. Do I need to serve them myself?" She flinched. "No, sir. I'm sorry. I'll." "Yeah, you will," he sneered, turning toward the kitchen. "And Brian, stop dragging your feet back there. We're not running a charity." James's jaw tightened. Brian Flax, a man who'd cooked his father's recipes with pride, who'd shown up every single day for 2 decades, didn't respond. He just flipped eggs in silence, shoulders sagging under invisible weight. The boss in disguise took a slow sip of his coffee and waited. When Amy Jane returned with his toast, her hands trembled slightly as she set the plate down. Her eyes darted toward Peter, who stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching. "You okay?" James asked gently. She hesitated, her lips parting as if words wanted to escape. Then she whispered, "Some days, no." Before he could respond, Peter's voice boomed again. "Amy Jane, stop chatting. Move." She winced and hurried away. James felt fire rise in his chest. But he stayed still. He needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. Not as an owner, as a witness. He motioned subtly to Brian through the kitchen window. The cook glanced over, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mind if I ask you something?" James said quietly when Brian stepped out to clear plates. The older man looked wary. "If it's about the food, sir, I promise it's fresh." "No," James interrupted gently. "It's about the people here. Is everyone treated right?" Brian froze. His eyes flicked toward the kitchen door, where Peter had just disappeared. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a rasp. "Sir, between you and me?" He glanced around nervously. "This place ain't what it used to be. Folks used to smile here, used to laugh. Now they just survive." His voice cracked. "We miss Mr. King. The real Mr. King. John Luther. He cared about us." The words struck James like a fist to the chest. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You ever meet his son?" "James." Brian's face softened with something like nostalgia. "Once. Long time ago. Shook his hand after his daddy passed. Told me, 'Keep cooking with your heart, Brian, and I'll keep the doors open.' Haven't seen him since. But we talk about him sometimes. Good man. Hope he knows we're still here." James looked down at his coffee, his reflection staring back at him in the dark liquid. "Maybe he's closer than you think," he murmured. Brian smiled sadly. "If he is, I hope he sees what's happened. 'Cause we need him." That's when James heard it. A whisper, faint, trembling, drifting from behind the counter like smoke. It was Amy Jane's voice. "Don't tell him too much, Brian. Peter said anyone talking bad about management gets fired." The words stopped James cold. His hand froze mid-reach for his coffee cup. His breath caught in his throat. His own employees, people his father had loved, people he had vowed to protect, were terrified to speak the truth. Fired. For honesty. James set his napkin on the table, stood slowly, and placed cash beside his untouched toast. He walked toward the door, his heart pounding, his father's voice echoing in his mind. You can tell the soul of a business by how it treats the ones who serve. As the cool Atlanta air hit his face, James stopped on the sidewalk and stared back at the restaurant through the window. The golden light, the elegant facade, the silent suffering hidden beneath. He pulled out his phone and typed a single message to his assistant. "Clear my schedule tomorrow morning. I'm going back to Paschal's. And this time, I'm not hiding." James didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until dawn, his father's portrait staring down at him from above the fireplace. Those kind eyes, that gentle smile, the hands that had built Paschal's brick by brick, dream by dream. The whispered warning from the day before played on loop in his mind. Peter said anyone talking bad about management gets fired. By the time the sun cracked the Atlanta skyline, James had made his decision. One visit wasn't enough. If he was going to save Paschal's, he needed to see the full picture. Not just a snapshot of fear, but the entire landscape of what his restaurant had become. So he returned. Same cap, same sweater, same worn sneakers. He parked 3 blocks away again, left his watch in the glove box, and walked through Paschal's doors at 8:47 a.m., the height of the breakfast rush. This time, he chose a booth near the back corner, half hidden by a decorative column, but with a clear view of the entire dining room. A perfect vantage point. The restaurant was busier today. Well-dressed businessmen sipped espresso at corner tables. A young couple laughed over French toast. An elderly woman in pearls read the morning paper, her teacup balanced delicately in wrinkled hands. And there, gliding through it all like a politician on election day, was Peter Crouch. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson." Peter's voice dripped with charm as he approached the elderly woman. "How wonderful to see you again. I trust everything is to your liking." She smiled warmly. "Oh, Peter, the service here is always impeccable." "We aim to please," he replied, flashing perfect teeth. "Please, let me know if you need anything at all." James watched, stone-faced, as Peter worked the room. Compliments for the businessmen. A joke with the young couple. A respectful nod to a city councilman by the window. To the guests, Peter Crouch was the picture of Southern hospitality, gracious, attentive, professional. But then a plate clattered in the kitchen. Peter's smile vanished like smoke. He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he stalked toward the kitchen door. The moment he crossed the threshold and thought he was out of earshot, his voice turned to ice. "Brian, what the hell was that?" James leaned forward, straining to hear. "Sorry, sir," came Brian's quiet reply. "My hands are." "I don't care about your hands." Peter hissed. "You drop another plate, and it's coming out of your paycheck. You hear me?" Silence. "I said, do you hear me?" "Yes, sir." Peter stormed back into the dining room, his smile snapping back into place, as if nothing had happened. James felt his jaw clench. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Two faces, two voices. One for those who mattered in Peter's eyes, and one for those who didn't. Amy Jane appeared at his table, her movements careful and deliberate. She still wore that same tired smile, though today it seemed even more fragile. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. "Coffee." James looked up at her, really looked, at the exhaustion etched into her young face, the way her shoulders curved inward as if trying to make herself smaller, the nervous glance she threw toward the kitchen before meeting his eyes. "Yes, please," he said gently. "And Amy Jane?" She froze, surprised. "Sir, you're doing a wonderful job. I just wanted you to know that." For a moment, her guard dropped. Her eyes glistened, and she blinked quickly, looking away. "Thank you," she whispered. That's kind of you to say." "I mean it." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the coffee pot. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to say something, then closed again. Finally, she leaned in slightly, her voice barely audible. "Things have been hard lately." James's heart squeezed. "How so?" But before she could answer, Peter's voice sliced through the air. "Amy Jane, you've got tables waiting. Stop hovering." She flinched, murmured a quick "excuse me, sir," and hurried away. James watched her go, his hands curling into fists beneath the table. Hard lately. Two words that contained universes of suffering she was too afraid to name. The morning wore on, and James observed everything. He watched Peter bark orders at a busboy for refilling water glasses too loudly. He watched a young line cook get berated for plating scrambled eggs with no artistry. He watched Brian move through the kitchen like a ghost, silent, hunched, his once steady hands now trembling as he flipped pancakes and stirred grits. At one point, James caught a fragment of Brian's voice drifting from the kitchen, so quiet it was almost lost beneath the clatter of pans. Mr. John would have never let it get like this. The words were spoken to no one in particular, maybe to the eggs sizzling on the griddle, maybe to the memory of a man who'd treated him like family. But James heard them, and they cut deeper than any insult Peter could hurl. His father wouldn't have let it get like this. John Luther King Jr. would have walked through fire before allowing fear to replace love in his restaurant. And yet here James sat, hidden behind a disguise, watching his father's dream crumble into something unrecognizable. "What have I done?" he thought. "How did I let this happen?" Then came the breaking point. A well-dressed woman at table 9, designer handbag, diamond earrings, the type of customer Peter fawned over, raised her hand with a frown. "Excuse me, miss," she called to Amy Jane. "I ordered the egg white omelet. This has yolk in it." Amy Jane's face paled. "Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am. Let me fix that right away." But Peter was already there, swooping in like a hawk. "Is there a problem?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "She brought me the wrong order," the woman said, annoyed. Peter's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes turned to Amy Jane with a look that could freeze blood. "Did you?" I thought I wrote it down correctly," Amy Jane stammered. "I'll get the cook to remake it immediately." "You thought?" Peter's voice rose just enough to make nearby diners glance over. "Thinking isn't good enough, Amy Jane. This is Paschal's, not some roadside diner. Our guests expect excellence." Amy Jane's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll fix it." "You're always sorry," Peter cut her off, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe if you spent less time chatting with customers and more time doing your job, we wouldn't have this problem." The dining room had gone quiet. Forks paused midair. Conversations died. All eyes were on Amy Jane as she stood there, humiliated, fighting to hold herself together. "Yes, sir," she whispered. James's hands were shaking. His fists clenched so hard beneath the table that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to stand up, to shout, to tell Peter Crouch exactly who he was and throw him out onto the street. But he held himself back, barely, because if he revealed himself now in anger, he'd only see this moment. He needed to see everything. Peter turned back to the guest with an apologetic smile. "I sincerely apologize, Mrs. Williams. Your meal is on the house today, and I'll have a fresh omelet out in 3 minutes." The woman nodded, mollified. Peter patted Amy Jane's shoulder, a gesture that would have looked supportive to anyone watching. But James saw the way his fingers dug in just slightly, the way Amy Jane winced. "Go fix this," Peter muttered under his breath. "And don't embarrass me again." Amy Jane fled toward the kitchen, her shoulders shaking. James couldn't stay any longer. He stood, left cash on the table, more than enough to cover the meal and a generous tip for Amy Jane, and headed for the door. But as he passed by the narrow hallway leading to the kitchen, he heard voices. Low, urgent, scared. He paused, pressing himself against the wall, just out of sight. "I'm so tired, Brian." It was Amy Jane, her voice cracking. "I can't do this anymore. Every day, it's something else. Every day, I feel like I'm walking on glass." "I know, baby girl," Brian replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I know. I want to quit," she whispered. "But I can't afford to. And even if I could, what would happen to you? To everyone else? Peter would just get worse." There was a long pause. Then Brian spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "We used to be a family here, Amy Jane. Back when Mr. John was alive. When his son James first took over, it still felt like that. But somewhere along the way," his voice trailed off. "Somewhere we lost it." "Do you think James even knows what's happening?" Amy Jane asked quietly. "I don't know," Brian admitted. "But I pray he finds out. 'Cause if he don't, I don't know how much longer any of us can hold on." Amy Jane's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. "Don't say anything bad about Peter, Brian. Please. He'll fire anyone who talks to strangers. You know that." "I know," Brian said softly. "I know." James stood frozen in the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. The weight of their words crushed him, not with anger this time, but with something worse. Guilt, shame, grief. "They're suffering because I wasn't here. Because I trusted the wrong person. Because I failed them." He walked out into the Atlanta morning, the cool air hitting his face like a slap. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the restaurant he'd built with his father's memory, and felt the full weight of what he'd lost. But then, beneath the grief, something else stirred. Resolve. His father's voice echoed in his mind, clear as the day he'd first spoken the words. "Respect isn't earned by fear, son. It's earned by heart." James pulled his cap lower, his jaw set with quiet fury. "Tomorrow," he murmured to himself, "I'm not coming back as a customer." He turned and walked toward his car, the morning sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Tomorrow, Peter Crouch would meet the real James Luther King, and Paschal's would remember what it meant to be a family again. The next morning, James Luther King arrived at Paschal's restaurant at exactly 9 a.m. No baseball cap shadowed his face. No faded sweater disguised his frame. No worn sneakers muffled his footsteps. Instead, he wore a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, a crisp white shirt open at the collar, and leather shoes that caught the morning light with every step. His father's gold cufflinks, the ones John Luther King Jr. had worn on the day Paschal's first opened, glinted at his wrists. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set, and his eyes burned with quiet purpose. He didn't park 3 blocks away this time. He pulled his Mercedes directly in front of the entrance, stepped out, and walked through the doors like a man reclaiming stolen ground. The bell above the door chimed, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. The hostess looked up from her podium, her professional smile faltering as she registered something different about this man. Something powerful, undeniable, almost regal. James stood in the entrance, his gaze sweeping across the dining room he knew by heart. The gold chandeliers his father had hung. The framed photographs of Atlanta's civil rights history lining the walls. The corner booth where Martin Luther King Jr. himself had once shared a meal with his father. Every detail was familiar, and yet everything felt wrong. The staff noticed him immediately. A busboy paused mid-pour. A waitress near the kitchen door straightened instinctively. And in the back, through the service window, James saw Brian Flax glance up from the grill, his weathered face creasing with confusion. Then came Peter Crouch. He emerged from a manager's office with his usual swagger, tailored vest buttoned perfectly, hair slicked back with expensive product, a clipboard tucked under one arm like a badge of authority. He hadn't noticed James yet. He was too busy snapping his fingers at a young server. "Table 6 needs refills, and I need them 5 minutes ago. Move." The server scurried away. Peter finally turned toward the entrance, and his eyes landed on James. For a split second, his expression was one of casual assessment. Another well-dressed customer. Another opportunity to perform his charm offensive. He approached with his practiced smile, hand already extending for a shake. "Good morning, sir," Peter said smoothly. "Welcome to Paschal's. Do you have a reservation or—" "No," James interrupted, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I don't need one." Peter's smile wavered slightly. "I see. Well, we're quite busy this morning, but I'm sure we can find you a table. Are you dining alone, or—" "I'm not here to dine, Peter." The use of his name made Peter pause. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying James's face. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" James didn't smile. "We do now." An uneasy silence fell between them. Around the dining room, staff members had begun to notice the tension. Amy Jane stood frozen near table 12, her tray balanced on one hip. Brian had stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Peter's jaw tightened. His veneer of charm was cracking. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to state your business, or I'll need to." "You can start," James said evenly, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant, "by packing your things." The words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Peter blinked. Then he laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Excuse me." James took a step forward, his presence filling the space between them. "You heard me." "Listen," Peter said, his voice hardening. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm the manager here, and I don't appreciate—" "Manager," James repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "Is that what you call yourself?" Peter's face flushed red. "I don't have time for this." "Security." "Don't," James said quietly, but with such authority that Peter froze mid-turn. "Don't make this worse for yourself." The entire restaurant had gone silent. Every eye was on them now. The businessmen at their corner tables. The young couple with their French toast. Mrs. Henderson with her tea. And most importantly, the staff, Amy Jane, Brian, the busboy, the line cooks peeking from the kitchen, all watching with held breath. James turned slowly, addressing not just Peter, but everyone in the room. "My name," he said clearly, his voice resonating through the space his father built, "is James Luther King, and I am the owner of Paschal's restaurant." The reaction was immediate. Amy Jane's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes going wide with shock. Brian's spatula clattered to the floor. The hostess gasped audibly. Murmurs rippled through the dining room like wind through wheat. And Peter Crouch went pale. "You," Peter stammered, his composure shattering. "You're—" "I didn't, sir, I didn't realize." "That's the problem, isn't it?" James cut him off, his voice like iron wrapped in silk. "You only treat people with respect when you realize who they are." Peter's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. James took another step forward, and Peter instinctively stepped back. "I've spent the last 2 days sitting in my restaurant," James continued, his voice measured but trembling with controlled fury. "Watching, listening, observing. And do you know what I saw, Peter?" Peter said nothing. "I saw my waitstaff flinch at the sound of your voice. I saw my veteran cook, a man who worked beside my father for 20 years, trembling as he flipped eggs. I saw fear where there should have been pride, silence where there should have been laughter, tears where there should have been smiles." Amy Jane was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. James's voice grew stronger. "I watched you humiliate a young woman in front of paying customers for a simple mistake. I watched you berate a good man for hands that shake because he's been working too hard for too long with too little appreciation. And I heard," his voice caught for just a moment, "I heard my own employees whisper in terror that speaking the truth would cost them their jobs." Brian pressed his fist to his mouth, his eyes glistening. "My father built Paschal's on a single principle," James said, his voice ringing out like a bell. "He believed that you could tell the soul of a business by how it treats the ones who serve. He built this place to be more than a restaurant. He built it to be a family, a place where dignity mattered more than profit, where people mattered more than power." He turned back to Peter, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "And you," James said quietly, "you turned it into a kingdom of fear." "Sir, I was just trying to maintain standards," Peter stammered. "I was trying to keep things running efficiently." "By terrorizing people?" James's voice cracked like a whip. "By making them afraid to speak? By crushing their spirits until they could barely smile?" I didn't mean they're just staff. I was just staff," James repeated, his voice deadly quiet. He turned to face the room, gesturing to the people watching with bated breath. "Amy Jane London," he called out. "Step forward, please." Amy Jane froze, fear flashing across her face. But James's expression softened as he looked at her. "It's okay," he said gently. "Come here." Hesitantly, she approached, her hands twisting her apron. James looked at her with profound respect. "You've shown more grace under pressure than most people show in a lifetime. You kept your dignity when others tried to strip it away. You served with kindness even when kindness wasn't shown to you." He paused. "Thank you." Amy Jane's tears fell freely now, but she was smiling through them. "Brian Flax," James called toward the kitchen. "Come out here." Brian emerged slowly, his apron stained, his face weathered but honest. James's voice was thick with emotion. "You worked beside my father. You learned his recipes. You kept his dream alive in that kitchen even when everything outside it was falling apart. You are the heart of this place." Brian's shoulders shook, and he nodded, unable to speak. James turned back to Peter, whose face was now a mask of desperation. "These people are not just staff, Peter. They are the reason Paschal's exists. They are the soul my father built this place to honor. And you," James's voice turned to stone, "you treated them like they were nothing." "Sir, please," Peter said, his voice cracking. "I can change. I can do better. I just need another chance." "You've had enough chances," James said quietly. "Every day you walked through those doors was a chance to lead with respect. You chose fear instead. Every time you spoke to these people was a chance to build them up. You tore them down instead." Peter's facade crumbled entirely. "This is their fault. They're too soft. They can't handle pressure. I was just enough." James's single word silenced him instantly. "You built fear where there should have been pride. You built silence where there should have been song. You built walls where my father built bridges." He stepped closer, his voice final. "You're done here, Peter. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings, and then I never want to see you in this restaurant again." Peter's face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You can't do this. I have a contract. I'll sue. You'll leave," James said calmly. "And if you'd like to pursue legal action, my attorneys will be happy to discuss the multiple labor violations you've committed. I'm sure the staff would be willing to testify. Peter looked around wildly, as if searching for support. But every face in that room, staff and customers alike, looked back at him with either contempt or relief. He grabbed his clipboard, his hands shaking with fury, and stormed toward the office. 1 hour, James called after him. Then you're trespassing. As Peter disappeared, the restaurant remained suspended in stunned silence. James turned slowly, taking in the faces of his staff, his family, and saw tears, disbelief, and something he hadn't seen in far too long. Hope. I owe you all an apology, James said, his voice softer now, but still carrying to every corner. I should have been here. I should have seen this sooner. I should have protected you. Amy Jane shook her head, wiping her eyes. You didn't know. I should have, James insisted. This is my responsibility, my father's legacy, and I let you down. Brian stepped forward, his voice gruff but warm. You're here now, son. That's what matters. James met his eyes and nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He took a breath and addressed them all. Paschal's was never meant to be just a business. It was meant to be a home, a place where people are valued not for what they can produce, but for who they are, where respect isn't given based on title, but on humanity. He looked around the room at the gold chandeliers, the photographs, the history soaked into every wall. My father used to say that a man's character isn't shown in how he treats his equals, but in how he treats those who have nothing to offer him in return. James's voice grew stronger. From today forward, that's how Paschal's will operate again. Not through fear, not through power, but through respect, dignity, and love. The staff began to applaud, softly at first, then building. Amy Jane was crying and smiling. Brian wiped his eyes with his apron. Even some of the customers joined in, moved by the moment they'd witnessed. James held up his hand, and the applause faded. Now, he said, rolling up his sleeves, let's rebuild this place, not for profit, but for people. And as the morning sun streamed through Paschal's windows, warming the restaurant his father built and he had reclaimed, James Luther King walked into the kitchen, picked up an apron, and began to cook alongside the man who taught him what loyalty truly meant. The soul of Paschal's had returned, and it had come home to stay. 6 weeks later, Paschal's restaurant felt like it was breathing again. The change wasn't immediate. Healing never is. But slowly, like spring thawing winter ground, warmth returned to the place. Laughter echoed from the kitchen instead of barked orders. Conversations flowed between tables instead of hushed whispers. The staff moved with lightness in their steps, their smiles genuine instead of painted on from fear. And at the center of it all was James Luther King, not ruling from an office, but present in every corner of the restaurant his father had built. On a bright Thursday morning, James stood at the grill beside Brian, his sleeves rolled up, an apron tied around his waist. The veteran cook was teaching him the precise temperature for the perfect cheese grits, his father's secret recipe that had been passed down like gospel. You've got to stir it slow, Brian instructed, his voice lighter than it had been in months. Not too fast or it gets gummy. Your daddy used to say cooking grits is like raising children. You can't rush it, and you've got to give it constant attention. James smiled, stirring the pot with careful, deliberate motions. I remember watching him do this when I was 8 years old. He'd let me taste test, and I thought I was the most important person in the world. You were, Brian said softly, glancing at him with fatherly warmth. To him, you always were. The moment was interrupted by Amy Jane's voice from the dining room. Order up for table 9. And James, your 11 o'clock is here. James handed the spoon to Brian. Don't let me burn these. Never, Brian promised, his eyes crinkling with a smile. As James walked through the dining room, he stopped at several tables, asking guests about their meals, thanking them for their patronage, listening to their stories. Mrs. Henderson told him about her granddaughter's wedding. A young businessman mentioned how Paschal's reminded him of Sunday dinners at his grandmother's house. Every interaction was genuine, unhurried, present. This was what his father had meant. Leadership wasn't about standing above people. It was about standing with them. Later that afternoon, James stood in his office, looking at the photograph of his father that hung behind the desk. He'd moved it there from the storage room, a reminder of why any of this mattered. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Amy Jane entered hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. Despite the warmth that had returned to Paschal's, James could still see traces of the fear Peter had instilled, the way she held herself carefully, as if waiting for criticism. "You wanted to see me, Mr. King?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "James," he corrected gently, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." She lowered herself into the chair, her eyes darting between him and the door, as if calculating an escape route. Old wounds ran deep. James sat across from her, his expression warm. "Amy Jane, how long have you worked at Paschal's?" 3 years, Sir James, she corrected herself quickly. 3 years, he repeated, nodding. "And in those 3 years, especially in the hardest months, you never lost your kindness. You never stopped treating our guests with grace, even when you weren't shown the same courtesy." Her eyes began to glisten. I just tried to do my job." "You did more than that," James said firmly. "You kept the spirit of this place alive when someone was trying to kill it. You showed dignity under pressure. You protected your fellow staff members. You embodied everything my father believed a leader should be." Amy Jane's brow furrowed in confusion. "A leader." James slid a folder across the desk. "I'd like to offer you the position of floor manager. You'll oversee the front-of-house operations, mentor new staff, and help rebuild the culture here. There's a significant pay increase, of course, and you'll have my full support." Amy Jane stared at the folder as if it might disappear. I don't understand. I'm just a waitress." "You were never just anything," James said quietly. "You kept your grace when others lost theirs. That's not common. That's extraordinary." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she opened the folder, her hands trembling. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," James encouraged, smiling. "Say you'll help me honor my father's vision." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something other than exhaustion in her eyes. He saw hope, purpose, pride. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes. Thank you, James. I won't let you down." "You never have," he replied. The next morning, Brian arrived to find his kitchen transformed. New stainless steel prep stations gleamed under the lights. State-of-the-art ovens stood where the old, temperamental ones had struggled. Fresh cookware hung from newly installed racks. And on the main prep counter sat an envelope with his name on it. Brian opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a check, a bonus larger than anything he'd ever received, and a handwritten note. "Brian, my father always said you were the heartbeat of this kitchen. I should have told you sooner, but I'm telling you now, you are irreplaceable. This equipment is long overdue, and so is this bonus. Thank you for never giving up on us, even when we gave up on you. With gratitude and respect, James." Brian pressed the note to his chest, his weathered face crumpling as decades of unspoken appreciation finally found voice. He turned to find James standing in the doorway. "Your daddy." Brian's voice cracked. "Your daddy would be so proud of you, son." James crossed the kitchen and pulled the older man into an embrace. "He'd be proud of you, Brian. You're the one who kept his dream alive." They stood there for a long moment, two men bound by grief, loyalty, and love for a man who taught them both what it meant to lead with heart. As evening settled over Atlanta, the last customers filtered out of Paschal's, their laughter trailing behind them like music. James and Amy Jane moved through the dining room together, checking that everything was in order for the next day. Amy Jane paused by the window, looking out at the city lights. "You know, most owners would have just fired Peter and sent an email about new management policies." James smiled, adjusting the last chair at a nearby table. "And what would that have accomplished?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But it would have been easier." "Easier," James agreed, "but not right." He walked over to stand beside her. "My father didn't build Paschal's for money, Amy Jane. He built it for people. And people don't heal through policies or memos. They heal through presence, through being seen, through knowing they matter. She turned to look at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's why you came back as a customer. You wanted to see us. I wanted to remember what this place was supposed to be, James said quietly. Sometimes we get so far removed from the ground floor that we forget who we're actually serving. My father never forgot. I did, but I won't again. Amy Jane smiled, a real, full smile that lit up her entire face. Then he'd be proud of you too. After Amy Jane left, James stood alone in the now empty restaurant. The chandeliers cast soft golden light across the polished floors. The photographs of history gazed down from the walls. The piano in the corner sat silent, but somehow still humming with memory. He walked slowly to table 7, the corner booth where he'd sat in disguise just weeks ago, a stranger in his own home. James slid into the booth, his hands resting on the table where his untouched toast had once sat. He looked around at the space, at the heart his father had poured into every brick, every decision, every kindness. The laughter had returned. The fear had fled. The family had been restored. He closed his eyes and felt his father's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. Proud, gentle, eternal. "We did it, Dad," James whispered into the quiet. The heart's beating again. And somewhere in the space between memory and faith, he could almost hear his father's voice reply, "That's because you remembered what I taught you, son." It was never about the building. It was always about the people inside it. James opened his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt complete. Not because he'd saved a business, but because he'd saved what his father had truly built, a place where dignity mattered, where people were valued, where love was the foundation. He stood, turned off the last light, and locked the door behind him. Outside, the Atlanta night hummed with life. And inside Paschal's restaurant, the legacy of John Luther King Jr. lived on, not in gold chandeliers or marble floors, but in the hearts of those who served, those who led, and those who remembered that the greatest wealth is measured not in profit, but in people. James walked to his car, his father's cufflinks catching the streetlight. Tomorrow, he'd be back, rolling up his sleeves, stirring grits, listening to stories, and leading the way his father had taught him. With presence, with humility, with heart. And Paschal's would be waiting, its soul restored, its family whole, its legacy secure. Every story holds a lesson, and every lesson reminds us of what truly matters. Thank you for being here. If you believe in stories that remind us of our shared humanity, please subscribe to Twister Stories, where every twist reveals the truth of the human heart. Your presence keeps these stories alive. Hit the subscribe button now. Thank you.